The majestic stone arches of the NYU Stern School of Business loomed over a bustling crowd of students. It was the day of the much-anticipated intercollegiate debate tournament, an annual event that drew the brightest minds from across the country. The air buzzed with excitement and whispers filled the halls as one name repeatedly surfaced: Barron Trump. Unlike his father, the charismatic and often polarizing President Donald Trump, Barron had cultivated a reputation for being reserved, analytical, and fiercely intelligent. At just 18, he was already making a name for himself as a critical thinker, excelling in economics and political science. His calm, composed demeanor sharply contrasted the often fiery temperament of his father, making him a fascinating figure in his own right. This year's debate topic had been a last-minute surprise, announced just 2 days prior: the impact of recent tariff hikes on the American economy. It was a subject that hit close to home for Barron, given his father's recent, controversial economic policies that had sent shockwaves through both Wall Street and Main Street. As the competitors filled the grand lecture hall, Barron walked in with a measured stride, his tall frame and sharp blue suit cutting a striking figure. He clutched a sleek black portfolio, filled not just with facts and figures but also with insights only someone with his unique vantage point could provide. Seated beside Barron was his debate partner, Rachel Kim, a rising star at Stern known for her fierce oratory skills and razor-sharp arguments. She glanced at Barron, noting the slight furrow in his brow. "You ready for this?" she whispered, sensing the weight he must be feeling. Barron nodded, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, let's do this." The debate moderator, Dr. Alan Foster, a respected economics professor, stepped to the podium, tapping the microphone. The room fell silent. "Welcome, everyone, to the NYU Stern Intercollegiate Debate. Today, we delve into one of the most pressing economic issues of our time: the impact of recent tariff hikes. Given the high stakes, we expect rigorous discussion and thoughtful analysis. May the best team prevail." The first round began with a formidable team from Princeton, presenting a polished, data-driven argument. They cited reports from the World Bank and IMF, arguing that the tariffs had sparked inflation, slowed global trade, and strained America's relations with its allies. Their polished delivery and extensive use of economic jargon impressed the crowd, drawing scattered applause. Then it was Barron and Rachel's turn. As Barron approached the podium, a hush fell over the audience. The room seemed to lean in, eager to hear what the president's son would say about his father's contentious policies. Barron adjusted the microphone, his icy blue eyes scanning the crowd. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before speaking in a voice that, while measured, carried an unmistakable intensity. "Tariffs are not just numbers on a balance sheet," he began, his words slicing through the tense air. "They are strategic tools. They have been used by nations for centuries to defend domestic industries, balance trade deficits, and, yes, to shift global power dynamics." He paused, allowing his words to settle. "But what if I told you that the recent tariff hikes are part of a much larger strategy? A strategy that, if executed correctly, could redefine America's position on the world stage." The room fell completely silent. Barron's piercing gaze seemed to reach every corner, holding the audience in his grasp. He continued, his voice rising with conviction. "Today, I will reveal the real intentions behind these tariffs, the hidden impacts that mainstream economists and media pundits have overlooked, and the shocking truths that even my father's staunchest critics have missed." A wave of murmurs swept through the audience. Barron's introduction had hit its mark, sparking a palpable sense of anticipation. As Barron stepped back to let Rachel take the next part of their opening argument, he felt a strange mix of nerves and excitement. He knew he was about to challenge the very narratives that had dominated the headlines for months and possibly reveal secrets that would change how the world viewed his father's presidency. As Rachel stepped up to the podium, she threw a quick, reassuring glance at Barron. She knew he had set a powerful tone, and now it was her turn to build on that momentum. "Let's consider the broader context," Rachel began, her voice sharp and confident. "Tariffs have historically been painted as blunt instruments, tools of economic warfare that disrupt trade, inflate prices, and spark retaliation. But what if they could also be used as precise, strategic levers to reshape global trade patterns, to rebuild American manufacturing and reduce dependency on foreign markets?" She clicked a small remote, projecting a series of charts onto the screen behind her. The graphs showed a startling trend. While the initial impact of the tariffs had triggered economic turbulence, certain sectors of the U.S. economy were beginning to recover, even thrive. Consider the steel industry, she continued, pointing to a sharp upward line. After years of decline, American steel production has surged by nearly 15% since the first round of tariffs. Thousands of jobs have returned to communities that had been all but forgotten. This is not an accident. It's a calculated risk. A murmur rippled through the audience. Even the judges, known for their stoic expressions, leaned in with interest. But this goes deeper, Rachel added, stepping closer to the edge of the stage. These tariffs are not just about economic numbers. They're about economic sovereignty. They're about reclaiming control over critical industries and reducing our reliance on nations that don't share our values. Barron watched as Rachel's words sunk in, her arguments chipping away at the conventional narrative. He could see the gears turning in the minds of their competitors. They had come prepared to argue against simplistic economic nationalism, but this was a nuanced defense that challenged their assumptions. Rachel wrapped up her segment, her eyes locking with Barron's as she returned to their table. He could feel the intensity building, the energy of the room shifting in their favor. It was now Barron's turn to deliver the second strike. He rose again, this time with even more confidence, his voice carrying a sharp edge. But let's address the elephant in the room, he said, his tone shifting from analytical to confrontational. The media has repeatedly framed these tariffs as reckless, impulsive, and destructive. They've been labeled as a dangerous gamble by a president who doesn't understand economics. But what if the real misunderstanding lies not with the policy itself, but with the assumptions behind it? He paused, letting his words hang in the air. What if these tariffs are not just about trade imbalances, but about reasserting national strength in a world increasingly defined by strategic competition? What if this is a calculated maneuver to force our trading partners to rethink their reliance on American markets? The audience remained silent, their attention locked on Barron. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a sense that he was finally stepping out of his father's immense shadow and into his own spotlight. Tariffs, he continued, his voice now resonating with conviction, are not merely about protecting domestic industries. They are about leverage. They are about creating negotiating power in a global economy where influence is everything. Barron could see some of his competitors shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their carefully crafted counterarguments starting to fray at the edges. And to those who claim that these policies will lead to economic ruin, I have one simple question. Why then are American manufacturers reporting record profits? Why are small towns that were once dying now seeing a resurgence of economic activity? As Barron stepped back, the audience erupted into spontaneous applause, a rare break in the usual decorum of the debate hall. He exchanged a glance with Rachel, who gave him a subtle nod of approval. They had landed their first major blows, but the real test was yet to come. They had to not only defend the policy but also dismantle the counterarguments that were sure to come their way in the next round. And as the opposing team from Harvard prepared to take the stage, Barron felt a fresh wave of anticipation. For the first time, it felt like he wasn't just defending his father's legacy, he was defining his own. As the applause died down, the Harvard team rose, their captain, a sharp-eyed economics major named Marcus Chin, striding confidently to the podium. He adjusted his tie, his expression a mix of amusement and determination, clearly ready to challenge the momentum Barron and Rachel had built. Compelling arguments, Barron, Rachel, Marcus began, his voice dripping with calculated politeness. But let's not get swept away by rhetoric and selective data. He clicked his remote, and the screen behind him flashed to life with a world map dotted with red and green arrows representing trade flows and tariff impacts. Let's talk about the broader picture, Marcus continued, his tone crisp. The tariffs you so passionately defend have sparked a global trade war. The cost of imported raw materials has surged, squeezing American manufacturers. Small businesses are struggling to absorb these costs, and consumers are feeling the pinch. This is not just economic theory, it's economic reality. He pointed to a specific chart showing a sharp rise in the cost of agricultural equipment, steel, and electronics components. American farmers, for example, have seen their exports to China plummet, costing them billions in lost revenue. Is this really the strategic leverage you speak of, or simply economic self-sabotage? The audience murmured in agreement, and Barron felt a familiar tension tighten in his chest. He knew this line of attack was coming. It was the classic counterargument, the idea that tariffs inevitably hurt the very people they're meant to protect. Marcus continued, leaning into the podium for emphasis. You claim that tariffs are about reclaiming economic sovereignty, but in reality, they are creating new dependencies. American businesses are being forced to find alternative suppliers, often at much higher costs, and consumers are paying the price. He let his words linger for a moment before delivering the real punchline. And let's not forget the political cost. These tariffs have strained our alliances and emboldened our adversaries. China, for instance, has aggressively expanded its influence in Africa and South America, locking in trade deals that could cut the United States out of critical supply chains for decades to come. The screen behind him shifted to a series of satellite images showing sprawling Chinese-funded infrastructure projects across Africa, including ports, railways, and factories. Marcus glanced back at the images, then turned to the audience. This is not a winning strategy. This is a strategic blunder. He stepped back, his team rising to join him, and the room erupted into another round of applause, this one tinged with a competitive edge. The tension in the hall was palpable, the stakes higher than ever. Barron leaned over to Rachel as the Harvard team returned to their seats. They're hitting the expected points: supply chain disruptions, international backlash. We can counter this. Rachel nodded, her eyes narrowing with focus. Yeah, but we need to flip this narrative. They're painting the tariffs as reckless. We need to show that they're part of a broader, long-term strategy. Barron took a deep breath, his mind racing. He knew their rebuttal needed to be precise, impactful, and, above all, bold enough to reclaim control of the debate. This wasn't just about winning a competition anymore. This was about defending a vision for America's future, a vision his father had championed and one he was starting to see in a new light. As the moderator called for the next round, Barron felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. This was his chance to break the narrative, to prove that the Trump legacy wasn't just about bluster and bravado, but about bold, calculated moves on the global chessboard. He rose from his seat, adjusted his jacket, and walked back to the podium, ready to strike back. Barron gripped the sides of the polished wooden podium, letting his pulse steady as he faced the audience. The Harvard team had landed a solid hit, but he knew this was his moment to turn the tide. Marcus, Barron began, locking eyes with his opponent. You've painted a dire picture, but you're missing a critical piece of the puzzle. You've presented these tariffs as an act of economic isolation, but what if they're actually a strategic realignment? He paused, letting the question hang in the air, the audience leaning in. You mentioned China's expansion into Africa and South America, Barron continued, gesturing toward the images still flickering on the screen. But what if that's precisely the point? What if these tariffs are not just about immediate economic gains, but about forcing a long-term recalibration of global power? He clicked his own remote, and the screen behind him shifted to a new map. This one covered in bright blue and green lines crisscrossing the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This is the emerging trade network that America is building, not just with our traditional allies, but with regions that have been overlooked for decades. India, Vietnam, Mexico. These countries are stepping up to fill the gaps left by China. They're diversifying their supply chains, increasing their investments in American markets, and creating new alliances that are reshaping the global economy. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Marcus's face, a slight tightening of his jaw that didn't go unnoticed by the audience. Barron pressed on, his voice growing stronger. These tariffs are not just about raising prices or protecting domestic industries. They're about creating leverage, forcing our trading partners to rethink their dependencies and reasserting America's position as a manufacturing powerhouse. He shifted his tone, leaning into the argument with a mix of passion and precision. And as for the American farmers you mentioned, yes, they've faced challenges, but they're also seeing unprecedented investment in new markets, driven by trade deals that are finally putting American producers on a level playing field. Barron glanced down at his notes, then looked back up, his blue eyes locking with the audience. Consider this: U.S. agricultural exports to India and Southeast Asia have surged by nearly 40% since the tariffs took effect. This isn't a coincidence. It's a deliberate strategy to reduce reliance on adversarial markets and strengthen our position in the global food supply chain. He clicked his remote again, bringing up a slide that showed a sharp rise in agricultural exports to countries like India, Vietnam, and Brazil. The real question isn't whether these tariffs are causing short-term pain. It's whether the pain is part of a necessary realignment. A temporary disruption for long-term gain. Barron took a deep breath, feeling the energy in the room shift in his favor. He was no longer just defending his father's policies. He was redefining them. And to those who argue that these tariffs are isolating America, consider this: what if isolation is the wrong word? What if it's actually independence? What if it's about creating an economy that isn't held hostage by foreign governments or reliant on unstable global supply chains? The audience remained silent, but Barron could see the flicker of respect in their eyes, the subtle nods from a few of the judges. He had managed to flip the narrative, to push the debate into territory that the Harvard team hadn't anticipated. As he stepped back, Barron caught Rachel's eye. She gave him a small, approving smile. They had taken a hit, but they were far from beaten. In fact, they were just getting started. As the Harvard team huddled to prepare their next rebuttal, Barron returned to his seat, his mind racing with the possibilities. He knew they had to keep pushing to stay one step ahead if they wanted to win this debate. He glanced at the timer on the wall. They had 2 more rounds to go and the stakes had never felt higher. As the Harvard team whispered furiously among themselves, Barron felt a surge of confidence. He had taken their strongest arguments, economic isolation, supply chain disruptions, and strained alliances, and flipped them into a story of strategic realignment. Now he just needed to drive the point home. The moderator tapped the microphone, signaling the start of the final round. Marcus stood again, his jaw set with renewed determination. He walked to the podium, taking a moment to adjust his notes before speaking. "Barron, you've made an impressive case," Marcus began, his tone respectful but firm. "But you're still ignoring the fundamental issue. These tariffs might create short-term leverage, but at what long-term cost? Are we really prepared to abandon decades of economic interdependence, risking a global recession just to play a high-stakes game of economic chicken?" He clicked his remote, bringing up a series of charts showing a steep decline in US-China trade volumes. "You talk about diversification, but the reality is that China remains one of our largest trading partners. Cutting them out of the equation is not just difficult, it's potentially disastrous." Marcus leaned forward, locking eyes with Barron. "And let's talk about the human cost. The small businesses you claim are thriving? Many of them are struggling to stay afloat, unable to absorb the higher costs of raw materials. And what about the consumers who are paying more for everyday goods? Are we really willing to sacrifice the economic well-being of millions of Americans for an unproven strategy?" The audience murmured again, this time with a mix of concern and doubt. Marcus had struck at the heart of the matter, the human impact of economic policy. Barron took a deep breath as he rose from his seat, feeling the weight of his father's legacy on his shoulders. He approached the podium for what he knew would be his final stand. "Marcus," he began, his voice steady and clear, "you framed this as a choice between economic stability and economic sovereignty. But what if it's not a choice at all? What if we can have both?" He clicked his remote, bringing up a final slide. It showed a complex web of trade routes overlaid with economic growth projections for emerging markets. "You're right that China is a critical trading partner," Barron conceded, his tone firm. "But that's precisely why these tariffs are so important. They're not just about reducing our reliance on China, they're about forcing China to rethink its own economic strategy." He gestured to the map, highlighting a series of emerging trade corridors linking the US to Southeast Asia, Latin America, and even Africa. "These tariffs are not an endgame. They're a starting point. They're about pushing our trading partners to diversify their supply chains, to reduce their dependence on a single dominant economy, and to create a more balanced global trading system." Barron paused, letting his words sink in. He knew this was the moment to take a risk, to push his argument beyond the conventional boundaries of economic theory. "And as for the human cost you mentioned," he continued, his tone growing more passionate, "consider this. What if the short-term pain you're so worried about is actually the price of long-term prosperity? What if the factories reopening in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan are not just symbols of economic nostalgia, but the seeds of a new industrial renaissance?" He leaned forward, his blue eyes blazing with intensity. "What if these tariffs are not just a gamble, but a calculated risk designed to restore American economic power and rebuild the middle class?" The room fell into a stunned silence. Barron could see the flicker of uncertainty in Marcus's eyes, the subtle shift in the posture of the Harvard team. He took a deep breath, his pulse racing as he delivered his final line. "The question isn't whether these tariffs are a challenge. It's whether we have the courage to face the challenge and come out stronger on the other side." As Barron stepped back from the podium, the room erupted into applause, the sound echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings of the lecture hall. He glanced at Rachel, who gave him a triumphant nod. They had done it. As the moderator called the debate to a close, Barron felt a strange mix of relief and exhilaration. He had not only defended his father's policies, but had begun to define his own voice in the complex, often brutal world of American politics. And as he sat back down, the weight of the moment finally hitting him, Barron realized that this debate had been more than just a test of ideas. It had been a declaration of intent, a promise to himself that he would carve his own path, no matter the odds.